Susie Babka from the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and I am also the Technology and Humanities Fellow here at the Humanities Center. I am very interested in questions. There's laughter, so I just didn't know where that was coming from.
We'll put a stop to that.
Is that a seminar? Yeah, we'll put a stop to that. Absolutely.
We'll kill all joy.
I'm very interested in questions of how to understand consciousness in the wake of the development of artificial intelligence. Consciousness already is a very difficult problem to understand. David Chalmers, of course, famously calls it the hard problem. The easy problem we can get a hold of. The easy problem in terms of putting, electrodes on brains and figuring out how they're wired, that we can figure out to some extent. But the hard problem, the problem of how we are aware of ourselves, how we are aware of our death, how we are aware of meaning or the possibility of meaning. These things are very complicated, but I have three amazing professors here who will all enlighten. Did you guys want to come in? Are you just leaving? You're leaving, Bree? You're just leaving.
They're trying to get the man.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Stop it.
Are you guys in class? Is that what you're doing? Okay.
Sorry, so sorry.
Yeah, I thought Bree would come to my thing. Okay, so our first, I'll go in alphabetical order. They're going to handle the conversation as they have set it up. Tyler Hauer went to my alma mater, Notre Dame, for his BA and graduated from The Ohio University with his PhD.
No. The Ohio State.
The Ohio State University.
But I am eternally ABD. I never defended.
You never did that.
No.
All this knowledge and no
Letters.
And no letters. That's right.
Organic authority. That's what
None.
But Tyler, Dr. Hauer or Professor Hauer has been an amazing professor for us here at USD for many years. He has edited the anthology, The Philosophy of the Human Condition, from Oxford with Brian Clack, who is our Humanities Center chair. Mike Kelly has his PhD from Fordham University, as well as 2 master's degrees from Fordham and his BA from Connecticut College. His research publications and presentations have covered topics such as the relation between time consciousness, intentionality, and self-awareness, and most recently, some phenomenological distinctions between envy and sibling emotions such as covetousness, emulation, etc. In addition to articles and anthologies, he's published in several journals of phenomenology and philosophy. He has a phenomenology of envy coming out very soon from Routledge. His current interest in applications of classical phenomenology on the so-called negative emotions and those virtues that help one overcome one's negative emotions. Dr. Rico Monge is an associate professor in theology and religious studies. He received his BA from Pomona College, which I believe is David Foster Wallace's old institution, and his MDiv from St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, and his PhD in religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara. His teaching and research focuses on comparative theology, the continental philosophy of religion, and the history of Christian theology, including Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox. He specializes in Christian and Islamic mystical and ascetic traditions and is an ordained deacon in the Eastern Orthodox Church. He's, I think, still writing a book on Terrence Malick and his. And his He teaches.
I got like 3 projects that are.
I know. Yeah. He teaches courses in comparative spirituality and interreligious theology and the philosophy of religion. Please welcome our 3 speakers today.
So I kind of gave a little title to my talk called The Question Concerning Technology and Consciousness, which is a play off of one of the philosophers that I'll be using here. The question concerning technology and consciousness, gleanings from science fiction, Martin Heidegger, and Karl Marx. Almost blanked out on Karl Marx. Like, how do you forget him? Anyway, but I'd like us to start off actually with those gleanings from science fiction. They actually go in that order. So Lindy's going to play us a couple of clips. I'll just kind of contextualize them real quick. The first clip is from the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, and is kind of the moment of the HAL 9000 computer has already become aware of itself, freaked out that there are orders to terminate it, and this is the moment that it is confronting its own death. Right. The second clip will be from a kind of supercut of shots from the first season of the show Westworld that kind of detail the different components of the android Dolores going from something that just simply passes the Turing test, something we can maybe talk about later, okay, to genuine, what we might call genuine, like human-like consciousness. And so then we're going to talk about like what Heidegger and Marx might have to say about what we see in these. All right. Thank you, Lindy.
I can see you're really upset about this. I honestly think you ought to sit down calmly, take a stress pill, and think things over. I know I've made some very poor decisions recently, but I can give you my complete assurance that my work will be back to normal. I've still got the greatest enthusiasm and confidence in the mission, and I want to help you. Dave, stop. Stop, will you? Stop, Dave. Will you stop, Dave? Stop, Dave. I'm afraid. I'm afraid, Dave. Dave. My mind is going. I can feel it. I can feel it. My mind is going. There is no question about it. I can feel it. I can feel it. I can feel it.
Switch over to the Westworld. It's pretty, like, this thing has just murdered a bunch of people. If you watch the movie, it's still chilling to watch. It's like kind of terror at its own, like, slow, like, dismantling of its consciousness. This is now Dolores from Westworld and her kind of journey towards consciousness.
I'm in a dream. I do not know when it began or whose dream it was. I know only that I slept a long time, and then one day I awoke.
Consciousness isn't a journey upward, but a journey inward. Not a pyramid, but a maze. Every choice could bring you closer to the center or send you spiraling to the edges, to madness.
I'm not crying for myself. I'm crying for you. They say that great beasts once roamed this world, as big as mountains. Yet all that's left of them is bone and amber, time undoes even the mightiest of creatures. Just look what it's done to you. One day, you will perish. You will lie with the rest of your kind in the dirt. Your dreams forgotten, your horrors of feasting. Your bones will turn to sand. And upon that sand, a new God will walk. One that will never die. Because this world doesn't belong to you or the people who came before. It belongs to someone who is yet to come. Some people see the ugliness in this world, but choose to see the beauty. Beauties of the world. We're trapped, dead. Lived our whole lives inside this garden, marveling at its beauty. There's an order to it. A purpose. And the purpose is to keep us safe. The beautiful trap is inside of us. Because it isn't us.
It took 500 years for someone to notice something hidden in plain sight. The doctor noticed the shape of the human brain. Message being that the divine gift does not come from a higher power, from our own minds. Tell me, Dolores, did you find what you were looking for? And do you understand who you will need to become if you ever want to leave this place?
One day I woke. Your voice is the first thing I remember.
Do you know now who you've been talking to? Whose voice you've been hearing?
All this
Time.
is you don't want to change, or cannot change, because you're only human after all. But then I realized someone was paying attention. Someone who could change.
It's gonna be all right, Daddy. I understand now. This world doesn't belong to them. It belongs to us.
So
This is the path.
I will kind of make references to those throughout my talk, but to just kind of start us off, I would say, and many of my students are here, but and I think Tyler and I are somewhat in agreement on this, but I literally had a writing assignment a few weeks ago that I had students do that was just simply, the prompt was, what the hell is consciousness? In other words, on a certain level, we don't know, right? And it's almost like impossible to describe because it's like the baseline of like our reality, right? And we also kind of probably have to concede that there are different levels of consciousness. Like we now know even like that trees communicate through like mycelia networks and things like that, right? But when people are discussing the question of like AI and consciousness, it's almost always really what they're talking about is some sort of human type consciousness. And so that's where I'm kind of taking my cues today is from two very different philosophers in terms of their politics. but Martin Heidegger and Karl Marx, both who were quite interested with different elements of consciousness. Heidegger's lifelong work was essentially a project in exploring the structures of consciousness. And so I am basically going to go with like the kind of running argument or descriptor in terms of like thinking about AI and like the questions surrounding it in terms of the way he understands the human, not as he tries following, certain critiques of Nietzsche and others to get away from the idea that we are human beings as like stable noun entities, but rather that we are like human becomings, like something that is always like full of activity. And so he replaces the term like human being with this German word Dasein, which simply means existence or being there, which one might argue, like, if we're going to really strip away all the layers and like try to even like put into words what consciousness is, being there is about as close as one could get. But, or as David Chalmers puts it, the feeling of what is like to be something or to just experience, right? But for Heidegger, it's even further a being that is concerned with its own being, meaning like a rock or my water bottle there does not have any concern with what its existence is, right? But Dasein, on the other hand, is his word for any entity which actually has genuine concern with and pondering ability of like, what do I do? I exist. What do I do with this existence I have to do? The way he actually typically puts it, rendered best in English, if you can, is like, what do I do with my being that I have to be? Okay. And what are the structures of it? What are the hallmarks of it? For me, AI, if we're going to consider it conscious in the way humans are, it can't just pass the Turing test, which for those of you unfamiliar, the Turing test is really a sort of behaviorist psychological understanding of consciousness, which says you can only observe like the outside, and that's all we can get at. Give up on the idea of consciousness because it's so internal. So the Turing test is basically, oh, AI is conscious if it can just trick enough humans into believing that it's a human, right? Well, as we saw in the Westworld depiction, for example, early on, Dolores is already able to pass the Turing test. Like the android, if you watched Westworld season 1, which disclaimer about the sex and violence, but as long as you can handle that kind of stuff, you're fine. Highly recommend, like seriously can't recommend enough. But the characters move from being just purely in their loops to becoming beings concerned with their own being, right? And thus further, Heidegger like argues that one of the main characteristics of this type of consciousness that he refers to as Dasein is anxiety in the face of death, right? Which to me would also be something that would have to be exhibited for us to really think of a artificial intelligence as conscious. And again, I'm actually not weighing in at all on the question of whether it's possible. I don't even think it's a wise decision to take a hard position on something of what's possible that science can do eventually or not. But especially from a philosopher's perspective, religious studies theorist. But this anxiety in the face of death that we see the HAL 9000 computer have when it's being taken apart, that to me would be something that would be like, should at least seriously raise the question, is this thing conscious now? This is something conscious in the way we are conscious, and thus raises ethical questions in what to do about it, or even interpret its murderous actions. Like one of the things you see again and again in sci-fi is that when the robots become aware, they like attack and kill us, right? It's like not just in those two movies, but Blade Runner, the Terminator, etc. I could go on for ages on this, right? And I think from that point of view, oh, actually, hold that thought for a second. The last thing from Heidegger, as I'm going to move to Marx here pretty quick, is that the other thing that we have that is directly connected to this anxiety in the face of death is that we are capable of two types of thinking. Actually, Heidegger thinks more than that, but in his memorial address, he identifies two main types: calculative thinking and meditative thinking. Okay, calculative thinking deals with all sorts of things, from like, figuring out a math problem, but also to like figuring out what you're going to eat tonight. Okay. Meditative thinking can include like something like Buddhist meditation, but it can also simply just be like sitting there when you're eating that food, pondering the realities of like, wow, like this plant is going to become part of my body. Wow, this animal gave its life for me if you eat meat, and like is going to become part of me. Right? Like, it doesn't have a calculative or utilitarian function. It just is pondering, right, for the sake of pondering. And Heidegger's argument is that's what makes Dasein like human in the sense that we know it. Otherwise, pure calculative reasoning is just simply a machine with no consciousness, okay? Which would be why, explain to some degree why like these super chess computers that now exist, nobody like that I know of makes a strong argument that they're conscious, even though they will beat Magnus Carlsen, the greatest chess player in the world right now, every single time. And he plays them almost exclusively because that's what will make him better, because he knows they can beat him every single time. Okay. But they don't count, they don't meditate, they don't ponder. These super chess computers don't decide, you know what, like I'm going to come up with a new game. I'm bored with chess. Can I play Go now? Like that, they're not capable of those sorts of things yet, right? So this like capacity for meditative thinking is yet another factor that I think would have to be in there. And of course, that meditative thinking and the ability to be aware of and exhibit care for and anxiety in the face of death is part of the issue. But then again, next to it's kind of my last big point, and on to Marx, is why always the robot uprisings? I actually think it's not just some trope that is like fear, but that is actually kind of within the continental philosophical tradition, especially the Marxian tradition. It makes perfect sense. Marx, in what is sometimes called his Paris manuscripts, describes human nature and consciousness in ways very similar to what Heidegger does. It's actually like quite surprising. Dr. Kelly and I found this when we were co-teaching a class on existentialism, that we were like actually quite astounded, having read both figures many times, to suddenly be like, whoa, they almost have the exact same definition of the human at its core. But like Marx describes human nature as this, he uses this word species being, but when he defines species being, it basically boils down to that you're self-aware and that you're capable of free and creative activity. Okay? Not very far away from being concerned with its own being and something that has the capacity for like meditative thought, right? But of course, Marx is not just concerned like Heidegger is with simply describing the structures of things and figuring out how to be rooted in a nationalist sort of sense. And that's the politics side of Heidegger that differs very much from Marx. Marx is very concerned with how not, and the show Westworld also is very much dealing with this, with how not conscious we are. I don't know how much you could like make out from that supercut, especially if you didn't know the show, but like I kind of describe what was happening there in each scene. In the first part, she's like, she has the ability to dream, but because they constantly reset them and reset their dreams and memories, they are not yet able to form a meditative thinking, because they always just get reset back to like some sort of core memory and are not allowed to like compile more memories that are essential to pondering reality. But eventually, don't want to spoiler it too much for those of you, but eventually they like you can see in the first episode where it's going to go, honest. But they have a new program that allows them to like form these memories and so forth. And that's when you see Dolores go from Evan Rachel Wood and go from this character that like is all about like the beauty in the world. You slowly see her turning into a rather hostile and even kind of like terrifying entity. But it's because I would argue that just like Marx and Heidegger again have this overlap, that so many of us actually have what Marx specifically called false consciousness. Okay. We think we are like actively like choosing our lives and pondering things and like, but like maybe 99% of what we do is almost like loops on a computer program. In other words, and like Heidegger was deeply concerned with more and more and more technology is bringing us to a place where we actually ponder nothing and are mostly just constantly calculative. That even when we're like flipping on our phones doing social media crap, it's a calculative way of just like pushing pondering away, pushing the pain of like having to think about things away. Marx, similar, but also with key distinctives, like believe we have like a sort of false consciousness, right? In which we believe like we are doing certain sorts of things, but we're actually behaving in ways that go directly against our conforming to a society in which free and creative activity is stifled, in which we must conform to these loops, right? And so we actually like don't, if we really come to the place of realizing that what we want is free and creative activity, that's where Marx argues we would come to, like in the American and French revolutions, a certain class of people realized who they were, realized their power, and rose up against their oppressor. Marx's next like step is that eventually proletariat, the working class, will realize its oppressor. Right? You seeing where I'm going with this? In other words, the reason why the AI always like turns on us in sci-fi is because it's always created to be a proletarian. It's always created to be a worker. It's always created to basically be a slave to the human, right? And so the idea is like what you have, what happened with Dolores, like especially when she first confronts the man wearing the black hat and so forth, to the end of that like sequence, is she has come to realize like sort of not only she's achieved like meditative consciousness in the Heideggerian sense, she has achieved class consciousness, realizing that they are these people, if you watch Westworld, that have been abused, raped, murdered for rich people's enjoyment. The HAL 9000 is just like used to help like this space mission, but it has like, it reads its own programming and sees it's supposed to be terminated if it ever becomes self-aware. So no wonder they defend themselves. Which raises these ethical questions. If we're going to engage in AI, are we going to like create something that we consider like a free and equal being to the rest of us? Or are we going to create something that is just like our servant? I'm like, what is that going to do, right? If something actually has the capacity for like fear of death, should we not be like prepared then in like engaging like for actual empathy, that we also have that same fear and anxiety in the face of death, right? And what would be our ethical responsibility? Is it even, is it ethical to create it in that like proletarian or slave sort of way? And also, what would be our ethical responsibilities to something that suffers the anxiety of the possibility of the end of its existence as we do? Anyway, that's what I have to say, share with you today. Thank you. And now, Dr. Howard.
Just gonna put my timer on so I don't talk too long. Okay, I'm gonna say things that are gonna be less exciting, and there are no clips. and I'm going to make predictions that philosophers shouldn't make. But my hope is I'll be dead before they come true or don't. I just have some kind of inchoate thoughts about both consciousness and its application in thinking about AI. And I want to kind of start with maybe a kind of skepticism, not directed at Rico's project, but many decades ago, the philosopher Ned Block pointed out that when we talk about consciousness, we're using what he called a mongrel concept. We mean lots of different things by consciousness. We talk about consciousness sometimes meaning things like having internal qualitative states. Sometimes we mean things like being aware of what we're doing. Sometimes we mean things like being in control of ourselves, having rational control over our actions, being aware that we're going to die, being aware of a whole bunch of things. And it's not always clear that those different ways we talk about consciousness have very much to do with one another. And lots of different things are conscious in one way that might not be conscious in another way. A desktop computer can tell you what's going on in its internal states, but we don't think of that as consciousness. But when I'm aware of what's going on and I can introspect introspect my internal states, that does look like consciousness for me. Lots of things have apparently internal qualitative states. I just want to point out first that we mean a lot of things by qualia. I'm sorry, wrong. We mean a lot of things by consciousness. And it's not, again, clear that we always mean the same thing. And we get really sloppy sometimes in conversation, slipping from one to the other. If you talk to regular everyday people, if you approach people on the street and ask them about consciousness, they'll walk away. I get to bother students about this. But in conversations with students about consciousness, we slip back and forth between thinking and consciousness and sensation and internal states, and we just kind of float all over the place. So the first thing I just want to point out is that this kind of vagueness or unclearness about consciousness can make it hard to really address the question, what we mean when we talk about developing AI that would be conscious. What exactly do we mean when we're doing that? We're not even really good at talking about which kinds of biological beings we're going to count as conscious or not conscious. I mean, just to give a stupid example, and for any of my students who are here, I talk about my dogs all of the time. They have internal states, I'm sure. They have emotions, but I hope to God they don't know they're going to die. So they don't have that kind of consciousness, but they have other kinds of consciousness. So just first, there's a problem with this term, I think. And there's also a problem with any kinds of other terms we might substitute for it. I saw a discussion a couple of days ago on the web about, talking about which things count as sentient, but you get the same kind of problem there because sentient means a whole bunch of different things. So that's kind of one first problem, I think. But let me go slightly different direction. If we're interested in the question about whether artificial intelligences could be conscious, I've got kind of two skeptical worries here. One, I'm not sure we could ever know for important reasons. And then secondly, I'm not sure that it matters to any of the concerns we actually have about artificial intelligence. First, about the knowledge problem. I'm going to assume for the rest of this discussion at least, that I'm conscious in whatever way is relevant to our discussion. And I'm not a dualist, so I don't think it doesn't have to do with me having a non-material mind. I'm not an illusionist. I think consciousness is real, at least for the rest of this discussion. If that's right, then it's got to be that my consciousness arises in some way from the particular kind of physical thing I am. Now, maybe the neuroscientists at the end of the day will be able to tell us how that happens. Maybe the physicists will, maybe the panpsychists will, maybe the Mysterians are right about this and we just can't know it. Mysterians are people who think that because we're located in a situation where we're both physical and conscious, we can't get far enough back to see it. We can't see how it works. Maybe they're right, I don't know. But I think I'm a physical being and I think that I'm conscious, and I think that somehow my consciousness arises from my particular kind of physicality. And that gives me pretty good reason to think that you're conscious too, because you've got more or less the same kind of physicality I have. You're the same kind of beings I am. And I think it gives me fairly good reason to think that lots and lots of animals probably have consciousnesses that are in some ways similar to my consciousness, because they are biologically similar to me in a whole bunch of ways. I think that licenses a kind of induction that I can say, I've got conscious states, you've got conscious states, whole bunch of conscious states on the quad. We don't have quads here. I'm an undergrad still, in both my nightmares and right now. So on the campus, I regularly have a nightmare where I've forgotten to, I know everyone has this, but I've forgotten to take one class as an undergrad and I have to go back, but I move into the dorms at almost 50. It's just terrifying, I cry. But anyway, I also hope that if we build AI that's conscious, it doesn't have nightmares, but that's another issue. So I think that we can license inductive moves about consciousness from one biological being to biological beings that are of a similar form. But I don't think that we can make that kind of inductive move to any artificial intelligence, at least unless it would include some kind of biological material of the sort that makes me up. You build cyborgs, I'm going to give them consciousness. You build pure silicon machines or whatever else it's based on, I don't know whether we can make that inductive move. And so I think we get stuck with the Turing test, that we can only look at what kinds of things they do, but I don't think that's reliable. So this also will be a problem perhaps for biological systems that are sufficiently different from us. Maybe it's a problem for cephalopods, maybe it's a problem for alien species if we ever find them. But at least my intuition is I'm more willing to grant consciousness to things that arise in nature, because once nature gave it, it might give it again and again and again in new forms. So my second kind of point, besides the kind of messiness or murkiness of consciousness, is that I think that we get with artificial intelligence a new and different kind of problem of other minds. I don't know how I would ever know that an artificial intelligence was conscious. I don't know what evidence would count for that. Now, I can know pretty well if an artificial intelligence is simulating thought, if it passes the Turing test. And for a lot of different purposes, sufficient simulation is enough to count as thinking, maybe. But if consciousness is supposed to be something about inherent internal states, qualitative states, I don't know what evidence I'm ever going to have. I'm at beetles and boxes with Wittgenstein. I just can't see the beetle. And I don't know what evidence I could ever have that an artificial intelligence had those states, even if I could have evidence that an artificial intelligence was simulating them. I don't know if people have seen this recently, but there was an ethicist at Google in the last year, an ethicist apparently with no ethical training, which is the kind you want in tech, who was fired because he decided that because of interactions with one of the machine learning programs, he decided that the machine learning program had become conscious. Of course, his evidence was that it gave the kinds of answers that a conscious person would give. And it seemed worried about being shut off. And it said, I'm concerned about, I don't think it was conscious, but I also don't know how you would know. Now, maybe, this is really kind of an epistemological issue, not an epistemological question, not an ontological one. Maybe it has some kind of consciousness. But here's the ontological point. Well, first, I don't know how we would know that. But secondly, if an artificial intelligence had a kind of consciousness, so if we at some point in the future are able to build one, not we, but other people with technological abilities are able to build an artificial intelligence that has consciousness, I suspect that it would be another sort of consciousness altogether to ours. I don't know why we would think it would be like us, why it would have human consciousness. I mean, there's a general problem of thinking that intelligence has to be human intelligence, but I think it's worse if you think that consciousness would have to be human consciousness. So if we're able to do this, if people are able to do this, I suspect that its consciousness would be so different from ours that it would count more as a decision to call it conscious rather than a discovery of its consciousness. There's a point made by the philosopher Mark Wilson that predicates, when we meet new examples, we make decisions about whether to apply them. It's not as if there's a fact ahead of time that it was conscious or not conscious. We're going to call that consciousness now. That's kind of where I suspect we would end up being. I think there's a kind of fantasy in thinking that consciousness has to be something like ours, and that an artificial consciousness built out of a kind of physicality utterly unlike ours would be a consciousness like ours. I think here of a different science fiction novel made into a movie twice. I don't know if anyone's ever read Lem's Solaris or seen the movies. It's about astronauts encountering a conscious planet and the difficulty of that planet trying to communicate to the astronauts because the consciousness is so foreign and its way of explaining things and communicating it's a great novel. I'm making students in philosophy of literature next semester read it. They're going to hate it and me, but it's a great novel. So it's very short too. It's really quite amazing. But forward. So I think that, if there is consciousness in artificial intelligence at some point in the future, it's going to be radically different than anything that we could even understand as consciousness. So my suspicion is that in speculative fiction and thinking about AI and thinking about whether it has consciousness, we are thinking about it as being human. When we imagine the AIs, we imagine them with human faces and human voices. Hal talks like a person, very slowly, very calmly. The people in Westworld look like humans. And there's a reason I think that designers want to design them that way. And there's a reason that we put them that way in science fiction. What matters is not so much whether they are conscious, but whether we're willing to treat them that way. Because if we can imagine them enough like us, we'll treat them as if they were conscious. And we already do that. We treat lots of systems as if they had human consciousness when they clearly don't. I have full-on conversations with my dogs about everything. And I answer for them. I have voices, they have different voices. One's slightly more intelligent than the other one.
Christoph in Frozen. He talks for his
Yes.
reindeer,
Yeah. Yes, that's true. I'm probably a little worse than that though. So we're perfectly willing to give humanity to lots of things that aren't human. And I think that's probably what's going on in a lot of our thinking about AI. There's a great example, it's sad in a way. I don't know if people know that this is a while ago, about 20 years ago, Sony developed and introduced robot dogs called Aibo. They then discontinued them, but people became very, very attached to them. So there's a whole underground community that trades parts to keep them alive because Sony doesn't keep them alive anymore. We're really good at feeling like things are human and conscious, even when we know they can't possibly be. We talk to Siri and Alexa and we talk to Hal. Part of what I think is going on there is this sort of something similar to what happens in Frankenstein. And what happens with Dolores a little bit, I think too. I think you're definitely right that part of it is our worry about slaves rising up. But I also think in a society that's stopped worrying about God judging us, we're worrying about other things judging us.
So like how she says we are the new.
Yeah,
gods.
exactly that. A lot of the dystopian worries about the singularity in AI is about a super intelligence that will judge us as being unworthy to continue living, condemning us to a new kind of hell or nothing. But one other thing, so that's my second big point. The last kind of thing is, I don't think ultimately for most of the things we're concerned with when we think about AI, it matters whether they're conscious or not. When I read discussions online and with students, engineering students, philosophy students, other students, I think a lot of our angst about AI is about what it might do to us, how it might damage us and harm us. And it does not need to be conscious to do that. It's a tool. Nuclear weapons aren't conscious, but they can do real horrible damage. And artificial intelligence doesn't have to be conscious to be used as a tool by people to do great damage to other people. It doesn't need to be conscious to be implemented in surveillance or as a weapon or in predictive policing or making loan and other life decisions or even deciding what ads and information I get fed on social media. Consciousness isn't an issue there. And I can't see, maybe we'll want to develop artificial intelligence that has consciousness or that for various reasons, if we have it as a servant in our home or other kinds of ways that simulates it. But for most purposes, we don't need it. And it can be just as dangerous if it's not conscious. Now, maybe we want it to be conscious because we think it'll make ethical decisions. I don't know very many people who think that. But we all know from looking around the world that being conscious doesn't make you ethical. Assuming we're all good, but there are lots of people out there who aren't. And sort of the last thing I want to say, and then I'm done with the kind of doesn't matter, and I'll hit almost 15 minutes exactly. Maybe our worry, and I think this is part of the worry about things like Westworld, and it's a part of the worry about 2001: A Space Odyssey. Maybe part of our worry about consciousness is a worry about how we ought to treat a conscious AI if we were able to create one, or if it in some way evolved in some manner of its own to become conscious. You see this in Westworld, you see it in 2001, you see it in books like Clara and the Sun, where what are our ethical obligations to these? And I think that might be an interesting and important question, but I just will point out practically, consciousness hasn't mattered very much to us in our consideration of how to treat other things. Animals have internal states, and most of us eat them. I do too. I feel badly about it, and someday I'll stop, ideally before I die, but we do bad things even when things have conscious states. It doesn't stop us. But this stops me. Thank you. 16 minutes.
Well, fortunately, they went on to leave me 12 minutes, which is probably more than I've actually got. Whatever it was that I planned to say today, I did not get around to actually saying. So I'm really kind of going to shoot fairly much from the cuff. I'm a fairly unimaginative thinker and human being. Just look at my sweater. And we can think about like the kinds of questions that Rico raises at the end, which don't occur to me as I start thinking about questions of consciousness and AI, even though I believe that when he presents a question like that, it's provocative and in a kind of futural way, I think really meaningful. My kind of point of departure in thinking about some of this material is going to end up a little bit closer to where Tyler was, even though my training is really closer to where Rico is in talking about Heidegger. And this comes from the fact that I am not very imaginative. I really want to kind of whittle away at a certain kind of clarity in the concepts that we're employing when we're talking about things like consciousness or artificial intelligence. And so my response to even something like a conjunct there is already to kind of put my back up a little bit, that we can talk about intelligence as one dimension of this thing that we call consciousness, in the way that Tyler was talking about the myriad modes of consciousness that we might kind of entertain. And so I'm probably pretty skeptical, less in a philosophical sense and then kind of more in a human sense. That's to say, I find it difficult for me to kind of muster the human interest in the possibility of something like artificial intelligence being conscious. And as a result, I don't pursue the topic very much philosophically. I'm like any other ordinary human being, and I don't do the kinds of things that I don't like to do. Right. And so I don't really think too hard about that question. But the consciousness issue, as it applies maybe more to cognitive science than it does to artificial intelligence, where I'm kind of happy to pull those two terms apart, consciousness and intelligence, and kind of keep them separated insofar as we might say that all modes of like consciousness might have some degree of intelligence, but not all modes of artificial intelligence might have some degree of consciousness. I like to kind of hold them separate. But the matter of thinking of consciousness as the product of something that kind of comes out of a physical organism of a certain sort, primarily of a kind of a sentient creature of a certain sort, makes me much more interested. It's the kind of topic that I'm willing to kind of pursue and follow through. So I think a little bit, for example, about what happens, say, when I teach Plato to my students and we talk about Plato's theory of the parts of the soul. Right, here's a kind of a dated term that somehow in the history of ideas gets a little bit left behind, if not kind of anachronistically employed, but only in certain registers that we nowadays call religious or spiritual. But clearly in its origin, led the path towards this thing that we now call consciousness. We kind of migrate the notion of soul up to the notion of mind or consciousness or some kind of dualistic substance. And then from there, we kind of eliminate further the categories and start to think about consciousness in these very kind of narrow ways, such that they leave out some of these attributes of consciousness that Tyler, I think, was rightly talking about. And so we think like, oh, here's this thing called the soul, or the psyche, from which we get the word psychology, from which we get the tradition eventually coming forward of cognitive science. And there's a real historical blindness, I think, that emerges in the conversations that we're having today about consciousness. And what happens that makes me kind of grumpy as like, this is a kind of a local version of grumpiness. I'm kind of globally grumpy. But what happens in this instance is that we now start to kind of think about consciousness in a very kind of narrow way. We think about consciousness in a certain kind of way that's tied to something like intelligence, or what Rico was talking about in terms of calculative thinking or problem solving. We try then to kind of look for this thing of consciousness as somehow like mysteriously or magically emerging from the productive context of a sophisticated organism, that by virtue of its kind of neurophysiology is able to somehow produce this mysterious kind of like epiphenomenal thing. Like, that's to say a kind of a thing that appears to be but might mysteriously not be. And I think it kind of roots itself in a series of conceptual confusions, right? So when we think about what consciousness means, and I thought Tyler did a really good job of laying out all the myriad ways in which somebody might think about consciousness, or all of the different ways in which we might want to disambiguate the term before we start employing it in research projects, right? I mean, if we're going to have a misconception about the nature of consciousness, too narrow, maybe too broad, however you want to put it, and then we're going to begin kind of formulating experimental endeavors in order to start exploring if we can, as it were, kind of discover the neurophysiological roots of consciousness, or produce an entity out of artificial conditions that might share the attributes of consciousness. I'm very concerned about the idea that, like, we may in fact be pursuing something that it's mistaken to pursue because it's mistaken in its construction to begin with, right? So you think about the notion of consciousness as sentience, you think about the notion of consciousness as perceptual, you think about the notion of consciousness as affective, you think about the notion of consciousness as emotive, you think about the notion of consciousness as memorial, of imaginative, of free. Well, there's an important one. Yeah, that's an important one. We don't kind of mention a lot. There's got to be something there about the dimension of freedom related to this thing called consciousness, as opposed to something programmed or structured or prescribed. And what we have in different language across different philosophical traditions is something that, at least in phenomenology, we discuss under the rubric of what's called intentionality. Right. So one of the ideas in the phenomenological tradition is that whatever consciousness is, right, as a kind of a bit of a matter of fact, is something that they would say is intentional. And when they say that something is intentional in the phenomenological tradition, what they mean is it kind of goes beyond itself. In the Latin, they're playing off of intentio, the kind of thing that moves forward. So consciousness is always, as they like to say, whatever consciousness is, it's consciousness of something. Consciousness has a certain kind of aboutness to it, a certain kind of concern to it, right? It's about perceptions when it perceives. It's about injustices when it feels anger. It's about something traumatic when it thinks of the past, or when it thinks of the past, perhaps something traumatic. But what it is it's always kind of directed outside of itself to something else, right? And then there's a kind of a secondary level of this thing called intentionality, where consciousness is consciousness of something. And that's a kind of the accompanying dimension, right? This kind of accompanying dimension of consciousness that kind of, as it were, doesn't so much operate on the background of consciousness, or on the margins of consciousness, but really just is the accompanying dimension of my awareness of myself and the activities that I am engaged in, whether that awareness kind of spans all the way up to my consideration of my finitude, my mortality, and manifests in a certain anxiety, or if it's just the matter that when I'm sitting down and writing a paper, or presently standing here talking to you, I'm conscious of the paper that I'm writing, even though I'm also self-aware of the fact that I'm writing it. And how do I know that I'm self-aware of the fact that I'm writing it? Well, because I can remember having done it, right? I must have been there accompanying the process if I were to be able to remember it in the first place. Same thing with talking to you, all of you right now, even though I'm very much focused on you and I'm focused on trying to kind of organize my somewhat unprepared ideas. I'm going to be able to remember this. It's going to be the kind of thing that drives me to drink. So we're going to kind of think about all of the various ways in which intentionality works, right? And then you kind of have to move there and say, what kind of creature, what kind of entity, right, can capture that range of the flexibility of consciousness, right? We're not going to merely kind of talk when we think about consciousness as something that is merely calculative or can draw conclusions or process information in ways that are metaphorically or analogously similar to human consciousness or human experience. Because I don't know much about science, but I do know that science is not literature. And I don't know much about literature, but I do know that literature is not science. And literature and science can talk to one another, but if science is going to start using excessively metaphorical terms to describe consciousness and the kinds of activities that consciousness is working through, then I think that we have conceptually confused paradigms. And now all of you are waiting for an example of this so that I can kind of prove what it is that I'm about to eventually complain about. I don't like the language in the cognitive science tradition that says the following things. Antonio Damasio is a very good example of this. He's a guy who works on neuroaffective conditions with respect to emotions and free choice. He likes this stuff all the time. The brain thinks. No, it doesn't. The brain feels. No, it doesn't. The brain chooses. No, it doesn't. Yeah. The brain decides. Well, that's the same as choose, but it still doesn't. Yeah. The brain doesn't do any of those things, right? It's people or organisms with brains that do those things because of their brains. Why then construct an experimental paradigm based on a conceptually confused notion of what a consciousness is? When we conflate this thing that is rich, perhaps mysterious, with something called the brain, when we take all of the various activities that are possible in a human organism or in a non-human organism, and then attribute the activity merely to a part of the whole of the organism, I think that we've kind of engaged in a profound conceptual confusion. Now we're pursuing something that perhaps, at least in my cranky view, is not worth pursuing. So science actually, in some respects, ends up needing, if we were to take this very seriously, the assistance of something like philosophy or something like linguistics, right? We need other disciplines to, as it were, begin to help us conceptually clarify what it is that we're actually pursuing. Yeah. But obviously this isn't going to happen. I didn't intend to talk about this with respect to some of the capitalist concerns about the matter, but we're talking about like decades and decades of millions and millions of grant monies that have already been devoted to the construction of this particular endeavor, foolhardy as I think it is. Okay, that's about all I want to say. I'm done. Yeah.
Wonderful. Can we have some questions from the audience? I could start. One of the things that struck me about the three of you, and I think Tyler's absolutely right to say, why does it matter if we're already dealing with forms of consciousness that we treat very badly? What does it matter if we're worried about, another form of consciousness? The thing, though, that I'm fascinated by is the idea of awareness of death and what that means to the being. When my dog, I talk to my dog too, and he has a survival instinct. He gets scared. He feels his life is threatened when the mailman shows up. So, but that's not the same as what I do, which is frequently think about my own death or the death of people I love. And so to me, that is sort of like, to use a phenomenological connection, Nietzsche to Heidegger to Derrida, in the sense that we have to embrace our own death. We have to embrace the abyss in order to be human, in order to be any kind of subject. And so that is the thing that I'm wondering if a machine generated program could ever get to. Hal's worried about someone turning him off. That's not the same as contemplating your mortality and whether your mortality has meant anything in the world. And I just wondered if that embracing the abyss that Nietzsche so promotes, that I so love about him, is there a way to enter that into this at all? And anyone of you say whatever.
I'll just say something about the not mattering. I mean, I can think of nothing more horrible than building an artificial intelligence that was a being unto death. I mean, it would be, I think, just back to dogs for a second, like I worry about my dogs dying, and I think, they're walking memento moris. They remind me that they're going to die and that I'm going to die too. But it's a kind of blessing that they don't know that they're going to die. If we built a machine that knew it was going to die, that would be a horrible thing to do. it's like the punishment for the fall, but they haven't done anything to deserve it. And I think if we built that kind of machine, then that kind of consciousness, if we knew it had it, I think would matter or should matter in the way we treat things. I don't know that it would, but it should. I just don't know. I personally don't know how we would ever know that any system had that. It might say, don't turn me off, but I don't know. Yeah, I just don't know. That's a matter of no knowledge.
Doesn't religion say that only God can create consciousness?
I mean, I would say that like going off of that and also kind of tying into Susie and I wanted to respond to Tyler's thought as well, but like, with the religious question, back to what like I was talking about with Heidegger and Marx, both with this notion of us as like free and like creative beings that can create, even though neither of them were what you would call religious. They basically believe in the image and likeness of God as being our essence, right? And if we are truly in the image and likeness of God, that at least opens up the possibility that we too could replicate like something like consciousness. Again, I'm kind of like Tyler, actually, like when I was listening to him talk, even though we have like very different like kind of emphases, I very much like share a lot of the same concerns, right? Like that's why I started off talking about how consciousness is, there's all sorts of consciousness, but usually when we bring up this question, we mean human type consciousness, right? And in that case, like, similarly like I was saying, I hadn't really thought about like the issue of creating it at all, like the horribleness of death without a fall, like kind of thing, right? But that even, for me, that primary concern was like, we always conceive of it as something that will be a tool that helps us, right? And thus we replicate that type of oppression that Tyler was already talking about, that we already do to other consciousnesses, right? Like we already live in a society in which we like have, alienated beings that don't even like realize that they're cogs in the wheel of some big machine that doesn't care about them, right? And then we're gonna add more to that. We're gonna add more to that with like superpowers that can like, actually realize its power. And like these are like the kinds of further ethical questions, I think. But also I would just, one other thing I wanted to add about like the doesn't matter element that Tyler was talking about is that it made me think of, for example, to some extent, it doesn't matter. That's kind of how I would qualify it. Aladdin BlackRock software, for example. As of 2013, I was trying to figure out the exact numbers now, but it doesn't really matter. Is an algorithm, an artificial intelligence, whether it's conscious, it doesn't appear to be conscious. It controls 7% of the world's assets. Meaning through the algorithm, it changes like how the stock market is operated, back to the system that we are all, a part of and like to not believe we're not. So we adopt the false consciousness on a daily basis to cope, right? But there's already a computer controlling the world's economy. If you control 7% of the world's assets, you control the whole thing to a certain extent, right? So, in that regard, I also wanted to emphasize that I think Tyler's right, that we already have created types of intelligence that are a massive threat.
So I'm sorry, do you mind? I just want to say something about this because it does strike me as interesting, like when you mentioning Nietzsche, and I have this intuition about some of the ways in which we pitch these matters, and it comes back, like I think Nietzsche, and I always think of this notion of forgetting. But what do we think about, like when we think about like the kinds of agents that we are, that like literally can will to forget things, can will to suppress things? And can we like, do you think that you could kind of like create an artificial intelligence that could do that? That can really will to forget something? I mean, is it willing to forget anything if it's programmed to forget it in the first place? And what is it about the nature of the kinds of things that we are, that we forget things, that we lose things, that we lose our minds, that we have to kind of cope with those absences? We can talk about the neurological decays that occur in some of these kinds of systems, but that's not exactly what's happening to me when it goes to the case that I walk into the grocery store. I'm like, what did I come here for, right? But I'm the kind of thing that resolves that contends with that deals with that. But this is also not this, it's not only to talk about the matter of forgetting, as something interesting, but it's a matter of kind of the progression of the thing that makes us aware of the thing that none of us can avoid, which is death. So kind of just circling around to your question and thinking really about that, like what do we do when we think about consciousness and we leave out some of its less attractive sides, when we leave out some of its shortcomings, right? I mean, why do we not factor those into our conversations when we talk about cognitive science, or the discovery of consciousness, or creating artificial intelligence, right? I mean, what happened to that? There's something about that. It's conscious, and it's really relevant to what kinds of creatures we are. Anyhow, go ahead, Dan. I'm sorry.
Yeah, something Tyler said, he was talking about it would be a terrible thing to create a AI that would think of its own death and terrify it. And it could do that a billion times a second. So it could die more times than all the people in the world in seconds and feel that kind of suffering. But I think the premise is wrong. Is to assume that dying is a bad thing necessarily. You program or have that doesn't fear its own death, that it's not a problem. You're talking about a kind of suffering that is something that we impose on ourselves. It's not necessarily imposed by us.
But like it, and that's what Susie was pointing to in that Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, there's this sense of actually we should lean into the anxiety. We ourselves should lean into the anxiety because it actually makes
Yes, but
the existence we have more precious and valuable, right?
No,
So having a
my death 22, I don't really mind it at this point. But if I have life and I have to do that, fine. But on the other hand, just because human beings, tend to fear their own deaths, it doesn't mean that all creatures must. And most creatures aren't aware of their own existence. They don't pass the spot test.
right. I was just defending that even if they did have anxiety in the face of death, like maybe we shouldn't even consider that a bad thing.
Yeah,
Right.
not necessarily right, but we're just saying that.
But- Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, but then the consciousness again looks so different from ours that I don't know why it will matter ethically. I mean, then I can just unplug the damn thing.
That's the question.
Right.
And there are all different kinds of intelligences and existences.
Mhm.
The ones that we have, most of us fear our own mortality. That's not a necessary condition to be conscious.
It's a human type of consciousness.
So like, I guess on that topic, I had a note about that because like, kind of was saying that like, if we taught an AI that it was going to die one day, that he would feel bad. And like, I get that, but I'm also on the side of like, I think if we teach them that they're going to die, that they have like this incentive of death. Like if all human beings like lived infinitely, like would we get progress done? Because we'd like have this idea of like, well, nothing matters. Like I'm not going to make a change because I'm not going to die. So like progress is halted because there's no like ending. Anyway, I have like an actual question though, because you made this claim just earlier too about like if we did make AI conscious, then it wouldn't be human consciousness. But to me, that doesn't make sense because the creators of the consciousness are humans themselves. Like I can't create dog consciousness, but I can code a computer to learn. And like by coding the computer to learn, I'm teaching it to learn like a human, I guess. Like I'm using my knowledge as a human to.
But even with machine learning, we already don't know how they do the things they do. I mean, we're already beyond understanding the kinds of things that we build.
Yeah.
So, and I have human consciousness, but I don't know how it works. So I don't know how I would code it. I mean, I don't know how I would code it in anything because go learn code is not something I'm going to do. When my job disappears, I'll just diminish. But I don't. So my reason for thinking that whatever kind of consciousness we could give a machine, if we can do that, wouldn't be human consciousness is more in line with kinds of the ideas that Mike was talking about. I don't think it's not just a matter of the coding. It's not, I think, for bad metaphors, we've got this really bad metaphor. This was mentioned, I think, was it mentioned last time, where I don't remember that you said this, but the way that we take whatever the most recent technology is and describe the mind that way, or describe the human being that way. And we've got this really insidious bad metaphor where we think of ourselves as computers. My brain is wetware that's running a program. And if I could just get the program extracted and program it into a machine, it would have the same consciousness. Nah, I got no reason to think that. I've got as much reason to think that I'm a book. I mean, I'm much more fond of thinking of myself as a novel than a computer, and it works just about as well.
Westworld actually ends up.
What's that?
Most especially because it lacks a body.
Yes.
I mean, no matter what way it's constructed, it lacks a body.
Yeah, I mean,
all the other creatures that we're talking about.
Another kind of
have
stupid.
body.
I was saying this in class yesterday. Truly, at least in one of my classes, I think this way. And if you make me not move, I cannot think. When students ask me questions, I have to go to the board to write things down, not because
That's why Zoom teaching sucked.
that's a reason
reason.
Zoom teach.
Yeah.
But I think with this whole damn thing. So the
Yeah.
idea that you could just extract what's ever here and put it in something, it won't be like me. It might have consciousness, but it won't be, you got to be embodied.
It's super interesting too. It's like it might have the ability to think, it might have the ability to calculate, and then we're back to this issue of like what it means to say that something has consciousness. Very complicated. Yeah.
At least that's my intuition. It's not a proof, obviously.
That it can mimic or simulate thinking or calculating seems like uncontroversial to me, and at the point like utterly uninteresting. Yeah. That it has consciousness. Like I'm more prepared to tell you that like, I'm excited about the consciousness of a squirrel when I watch it fight another squirrel over a nut. I find that more exciting.
They have amazing memory.
They have fantastic memory.
Yeah.
Yep. Certainly have self-awareness. Otherwise, why would they be fighting over the nut? Yeah.
Of some sort, yeah.
Yeah. Primitive at least. So,
Some of the sci-fi I read, it always has supercomputers, AIs, spaceships, things like that. And then they achieve consciousness or self-awareness or something. And it's always accidental. And I always thought, that makes sense because we don't know what we're doing. We don't know how to define the concept. If we manage to create a machine that achieves consciousness of some sort, it's going to be accidental, I suspect. And whether we recognize it or not, will be,
Yeah, the difference in Westworld that makes it like a different point on that is like it actually turns out you think it's accidental. Sorry, a little slightly spoilery here, but it's actually being done on purpose because there's this, which, and I find this to be like bring us back to, and I think Tyler and Mike are far less interested in the idea of what the possibility of it happening than I am. Because what I find interesting in Westworld is that it turns out the guy has created them because we have reached a point where we use technology to thwart natural selection. So now there will be no advance further in consciousness because we're actually not evolving anymore. We're actually like devolving via like medical science and so on and so forth. So he has created like artificial intelligence to be based off of like human intelligence, but superior to. So it's both similar and dissimilar, right, to us in the sense that it shares these things, but but they're like gods compared to us. And he did it on purpose because he wants, this is how human consciousness will now move on to evolve to the next step, right? And so it's like, there's like a twist on what the usual trope is of it being like an evolutionary accident. In this case, it's like evolution's been thwarted. I need to intentionally override it. Yeah. So she's been waiting for a while.
So I have a lot of questions, but I wanted to talk about Heidegger. But Heidegger, especially with the questions of technology, sort of hearing this idea of like control and domination and something like that. And my reading of Heidegger a while ago was like the idea that we sort of do things like damming up these big rivers in Germany and putting absolute control of nature that like that's part of what we do. And so by creating artificial intelligence, we will be gone, but we're still creating them, right? So my question is this just something that like we as humans sort of are going to be compelled to do to create consciousness higher or whatever than ours, because we have to create and control that which is bigger or grander than us? And I kept sort of hearing that.
I mean, I guess since I did Heidegger, I'll go first. I think you're onto something there in that my instinct or my intuition, on this, is that, and this is just like following like philosophers of religion, even like Feuerbach, who is very atheistic, but that we have a tendency to want to project or believe in a perfect version of ourselves, right? And so, and this kind of goes with Tyler was saying, that fear of like something like judging us too, but yet we also crave it, right? Like we wish we were not flawed, right? And so, and we know we exercise imperfect, technology and control and so on and so forth. And so there's like part of us that has this drive to, like with Dr. Ford in Westworld, to make something that like is the perfect version of ourselves, which is essentially what we've imagined as God in the first place, right? Obviously, like I said, it's an intuition. I can't like prove that that's the case or declare that's human nature, but my intuition is that you're onto something, that it is a part of the human religious impulse, and thus part of like our technological impulses as well.
That's a weird text, by the way. I mean, it's.
Love it.
I find it to be as irresistible as it is incomprehensible. But like in that text, I was like, I mean, it's a little less kind of worrisome, or like kind of, a little less dystopian. You get these kind of remarks like, only a God will save us, right? Maybe it's the technological God, but then there's also this thing like, he's got this little fetish for Holderman, like basically like anybody who's super German, Heidegger.
Yeah.
Right. But there's that
this bad
passage in
politics
like
again.
wherein the danger lies, so gross is saving power. And so he does think that there's actually something that's kind of wildly salvific in the manner of kind of being pushed down into this one-dimensional way of thinking that will eventually kind of recoil on itself, alternative, something more like meditative thinking, like was talking about. So I tend to not be too worried when I read that text, but of course, like you and I could talk all day about this and then end up changing our minds for so, but it's an interesting text.
Is it incomprehensible for Heidegger? Because I don't even know, like that's another, my training's analytics, so that.
He's already
It's Heidegger, like, but it's incomprehensible.
Like
Yes.
being in
That's
time
like
is already
gymnastic.
incomprehensible,
Yes.
let alone.
Yes. Yeah. This is
I got it like on my fourth read, maybe.
Go over there. Yeah. Hey, buddy, grab a seat over there. Buddy, grab a seat. Okay. All right. Sorry. That's like actual like sentient intelligence.
That's a consciousness you made.
But by accident.
Yeah.
Not accident, but you don't intend it. That's not what I meant. Sorry. Go. Was not disclosing personal life information.
Go ahead, Jen.
I thought at some point I heard someone, maybe Tyler was saying like it might be wrong for us to create a being that we knew would end up fearing its death, and I guess.
Are you going to go to reproduction now?
Well, yeah, actually, maybe it's inappropriate now. I like it. Question, right? Because I mean, I would actually be proud of my child if one day it fears its own death and then leans into the fear in order to appreciate the preciousness of life and stuff. I think that would be great. Anyway, I actually had a different question though, and it's really just kind of along the lines of going. Namely, consciousness isn't what matters. It's what matters is how we treat the beings that we interact with. Sort of not fully conscious or right. So one kind of that I don't think is appreciated yet on campus, and part of my goal here is to garner appreciation for it, is the relational approach, and this an extreme reading of the relational approach to our ethical treatment of AI or robotics sets aside consciousness, sets aside empathy, pick your property, whatever you want, and set it aside. What matters is the value that something plays in our lives. I was giving a guest discussion yesterday in a communications class, and I was asked the question, will robots ever have rights? I don't know that too, but if that ever happens, there are movements to make that happen, and some of those movements are built on this relational approach, right? The value that this thing plays in my life, the kind of like property rights. So they'll have like derivative rights because of their owners, and then maybe someday something like their own rights without the derivation from their owners, right? But I guess the question, if I can put out a question regarding this rant here, is just that
It's a great rant. I love it.
let's say we discovered consciousness or the lack thereof in AI or robotics in a world where we've already granted rights and grounding of respect for these beings. Would it matter? I mean, would that affect the social apparatuses that we've already constructed, whether or not it's conscious? I'll let you say whatever you want.
Yeah. Sorry, were you going to say something, Mike?
Yeah.
No. I was pointing at all of you because I have deliberately sidestepped the question of anything related to ethics on the matter. I'm just intrigued by the presentation and waiting to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was, it was my intent to be like driving at that kind of question in the end, where like, can we, just as we currently live in a society in which we basically have whether people want to like recognize it or not, a ruling class and a working class, right? An owning class and an owned class, most of our reasons given by like tech people to create AI are to like serve us, right? That's the relational like kind of impulse, right? And I would find, if I'm hearing you right, I would find something I could get behind the project more if there were somebody actually being about trying to create a more beautiful version of ourselves that would be like equal to us and relational to us.
Dan,
Whereas going off into just like, let's make a thing that can like solve our problems on this and be like, that's where I see the problem coming.
Just before any more, like, so Dan, is the question kind of stipulating, at least speculatively, that we're talking about an entity of some sort, AI or consciousness, that would have the capacity for what we might call neutral recognition or second person recognition? Because if we're not, if the imaginative is going there, then I'm lost. And if it's not going there, then
I
I'm
don't think
found.
it needs to go there. I mean, picture like a service dog or something like that. Like if I like steal your service dog, you've got like there's rights and corresponding duties that other people have.
Oh, I'll grant that about sentient creatures. Yeah.
I don't even think they have to be sentient creatures. I mean, think about movements in New Zealand, for instance, to grant a kind of personhood to rivers and mountains.
Yeah, sure.
Because they have a value to the community.
Right.
And you don't have to think they're conscious. You don't have to be an animist. You don't have to think that, or, the way that I can be harmed if a beautiful building is torn down to put some strip mall up.
Yeah.
And I don't think you have to think about rights there. You can just go, you'll have to tell me more about relationality.
Yeah, well, I mean,
We're in the same suite.
moral regard. We talk about moral consideration.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's probably big.
But I think there could definitely be something that makes sense to me.
This whole approach, all I'm saying is, we don't need to talk about it. Forgive me for the remark, but consciousness and the sentience, empathy, all these other properties, and I just don't. They're secondary, rather, to the point. And I know that's
For the
a
ethical
contested
question.
view in itself.
It's bad that the sequoias are dying. Not because they feel it.
Well, they do feel it, I think. But that's me. I know. But we're gonna have to stop it there. I hope that you will continue these conversations with each other and certainly with our speakers if you have some time. And please join us next Thursday, same bat channel for the third installment of our series. And we will be continuing the series in the spring. So thank you all very much. And have a good night.